right. I am not exactly sure what day it's going to be when you watch this because it's definitely, what I do know is it's going to be a different day than the day I recorded it. Welcome back to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are continuing to explore the landscape of learning, workplace technologies, and honestly, all things people development. I am actually, well, by the time you see this, I will likely be off. I'm taking a little bit of a sabbatical from creating content, but I had so many things that I wanted to talk about before I went off. I decided to take some time and actually record it. So this is the first in two parts of what I would call trends to watch. Well, of course I call it that. That's what I titled the video. It is trends to watch in 2023. What I want to highlight in this, and just a couple things. So first of all, one, for those of you who are listening to this live, if you wanted a chance to see this before it went live, you should have joined the Learning Sharks community, because I did pre-release this out to community members back, well, I won't tell you when, but long before it actually went live. So definitely, on housekeeping items, if you're not part of the community, I would highly recommend you join it and hang out with all of your favorite professionals over there, where we're talking about this stuff on a regular basis. But the purpose of the trends to watch in 2023 is really less of, my goal with this isn't necessarily to show, excuse me, there's a tongue twister for you, show some shiny baubles and encourage everybody to chase these baubles down. My same approach of recommending that everybody put critical thought and prioritization into what you're pursuing still stands. But there are some really interesting things happening in our space that either have been happening, but I don't feel have gotten enough attention, are overcomplicated, and maybe I would like to just create some greater clarity around, or have not just gotten the attention that I think they should have, because there's still more emerging trends. So it's a little bit of a mix. I actually started with this, I only had a handful, and by the time I was done, I'd blown it out to 10. So that's why this is actually a two-part series. And realistically, we'll see how many I actually get through. It might turn into a 3 or a 4-part series. Who knows? There's some other topics I have that I'll also be sharing alongside this. But right now, as it stands, I have 10 items that I want to dig into for things that we should watch and consider in 2023 as professionals in our field. So that's the breakdown. I'm going to go into each one individually. If all goes well, I'm going to cover 5 in each of the episodes. But if we go a little long, the nice thing is I can do whatever I want. So I can go short, I can go long. I have the power. There's no guest that's beholden to my timeline. So that's the plan for this. And if you end up watching this after the fact, or if you're listening to it and there's certain chunks you want to go back to, I will again remind folks that I have started timestamping major sections of these long form content pieces. And on YouTube, I've actually broken it down into chapters. So if you're trying to find the components that maybe stood out, or you really want to zoom in on something and you don't remember where it was in the larger conversation, I have tried to make that easier for everyone in an attempt to put best practices that we should be using in our field into my own work. So definitely, if you're looking at this after the fact, or there's a component you want to go back to, definitely check it out on YouTube where I've got that. So with that said, let's get into some of these trends that I think we need to pay close attention to and thoughtfully consider as we go into 2023. So the first one may sound like, really? That's where we're going with this? It's video. I had a conversation based on when I'm recording this. It's on a relatively close heels to my conversation with John Hudson and Tara Ellis from Luma One, where we were talking about the possibilities with video. And all three of us universally agreed we are still, as an industry, vastly underutilizing video. Despite the fact it's prevalent everywhere we go, most people are consuming content in video format across the board from a consumer standpoint. However, what I find in a lot of L&D organizations, what I'm seeing in terms of trends in our orgs, video is still vastly underutilized. We're not digging into it. And there's still a number of things that I think are holding people back from really getting into this. Some of it is just the reality that video is often perceived, I think, as a more complicated medium to work with, which, to be fair, there's some truth to that. It is much more complicated to work with video as a medium than text. I agree with that. While at the same time, if you're not following the trends and the technologies that are working with video, it is actually becoming much, much, much easier to work with video as a medium. There are a number of platforms that now allow you to edit and produce video like you would a text document. So I think the fact that we are shying away from video still reflects some of the historical complications and challenges that existed with video. I think there's some other things going along with that as well. I think there's still, despite the fact, and this is something that we talked about on the show, despite the fact many of us are used to being in Zoom meetings, we're used to being on camera for these, what we would consider informal interactions or even formal interactions. The idea of being recorded and then repurposed for learning, I personally have just seen in conversations and perceptions from people, there still is a fair amount of discomfort with that. And some of this comes, I think, from the idea that we're still largely, not just us, but I think people in general are largely uncomfortable with content that has them in it. It's just a comfort level thing. So all that to say, I think one, the tech has come a long way in terms of working with the medium. So if part of your barrier to that, and I only think it's going to get better, where I have seen some of the tools, I'll be careful which tools I mention because I don't want to necessarily seem like I'm advocating, but there are a number of tools that have just made working with video, which by the way, if you are curious, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share some. But there are so many tools out there that are really making it easier. So if you're looking at your org and you go, we'd really like to work with video more, but it's just not something maybe our designers or our teams are hyper comfortable with. We're struggling to kind of figure out how to navigate it. We don't have the high-end equipment to do this. I think you're really missing opportunities to capture a powerful medium for not only communicating messages and communicating content, but also communicating humanity and making it feel more authentic. And there's a lot you can do with video that you cannot do through other mediums. Does that mean everything you do should be a video? No. And this is where I say with these trends, I don't ever want to encourage people to chase these things as a shiny bauble. I still think even with video, you have to thoughtfully consider, what are we doing with video and how are we going to use it? Should everything you do be in video format? No, because it still does have some legitimate limitations in terms of you may have users in regions where high-speed internet is not as prevalent. So that can be a barrier. You still have the localization challenges. While AI has made localization of subtitles and things like that much better than it was, there are still some legitimate challenges to making video content rich. I think the other thing with it is a lot of times there still is this tendency, and I think to some degree, YouTube and Instagram and things like that may actually be further contributing to this, that when we think about video, we think about high production quality and degrees of effort that go into that. We're not always really comfortable with just creating raw, informal video content. And to what I was saying about Instagram and YouTube, sometimes that's actually contributing to it, because even some of what looks like raw content, there's a whole production studio behind that. And many people don't always realize that. So I think that's one of the things. And then they create raw content and compare it to, wow, my raw content looks so much worse than this. I think we need to get over that, because from an end user, I think people would prefer to have that kind of engagement and interaction through video content than other formats in the right uses. Now, in terms of application, I think there are two areas where we can really lean into video as a consideration as we go into the next year. One is obviously in our own shop, our L&D generated content. A lot of the content that I am seeing come out is still in traditional formats. And I think that's a miss. I think that's a miss for us to not say, hey, why are we not using tools like video studios, virtual studios, things like that? Why are we not using our phones to create raw micro-learning content, where maybe we're just quickly creating a video about something, creating a video messaging something to go alongside some of our learning content? I think we need to lead into some of that. Now, I will say with video, there was a trend for a while. Animated videos used to be a really big thing. I'm seeing a lot less of those. I think, again, part of the challenge there was when that trend boomed, it seemed like everything was an animated video. And I think things have pulled back a little bit from that. So the biggest thing is, I think within our L&D shops, there is opportunity for us to do this. And just to encourage some of these things, these virtual studios, even the one that I'm producing this in, come at very low costs. And the ability to produce raw, informal, conversational content, similar to like what you'd see on Learning Tech Talks, where maybe you're having a conversation with a subject matter expert. When you think about opportunities like that to say, rather than creating a high production e-learning, why not have a 10 or 15-minute conversation with a SME about some of the big things that we're trying to make sure get across in our content, and then use an easy to do application to edit it up if you need to, or leave it as it is. If you put some of these virtual studios, the ability to put an intro and conclusion right into the video and make it feel like, hey, we were able to create really rapid, raw, disposable content that serves a purpose, has a high production quality still, yet we can dispose of it if the need moves on and we don't need it anymore. I think there's a real opportunity for us to do more with that. And I think the tools are making it so much easier. I think the other thing with it is there's so much opportunity for us to expand what's happening with user-generated content around video. And with this, I think sometimes our initial response goes to, oh, let's have users share videos of them sharing best practices or videos of them showing people how to do stuff. And I think that, yes, is a huge opportunity for that. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to do that. That does require, there are some challenges, and I think the tech does need to help us. And this is where, if you're looking at doing more around user-generated content, I would highly recommend exploring some of the tech out there that is streamlining these workflows. Because the reality with raw user-generated content like that, where you're actually asking an end user to produce content, you need to reduce the friction and the barriers for them to do that. And you need to make workflows that are really easy to work with that content. And I think that's where some of these niche specialty tools that are focusing on video workflows are something we should be exploring if we want to do more with user-generated content. Doesn't mean you can't get started in it, but I will tell you, it will vastly increase your success rate if you're looking at that. That said, to me, that's only one component of user-generated content. I think so often we overlook how much content or potential content in video form is actually being created in our organizations on a regular basis. Just to give one example, and again, just something to be thinking about as you think about next year, I am the first to say hitting record on a Zoom meeting or a Ring Central meeting or whatever Teams meeting, and then just taking that raw video and chucking it out into the ether and saying, hey, everybody, we're creating a huge library of training content. Honestly, even if you're able to put searchability on that and make it people find, if it's truly just a raw form of a meeting, chances are there's not going to be a whole lot there. That's my take on it. I've seen it work in some organizations, but in general, I don't know that a lot of people are looking to look back on meetings. That said, there are a lot of really valuable, helpful nuggets that come out of meetings, especially meetings where it's designed around knowledge sharing or best practice sharing or things like that, which does happen a fair amount. And when you think about this, we're generating hours, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of hours of this content every year, maybe even every month, depending on the size of your organization. Using some of these really easy tools, you can quickly get one of those meetings, transcribe it, and find the nuggets in here, find some of those knowledge sharing nuggets, and then take them and repurpose them. And I think, to me, this is one of those areas when we think of user-generated content, I think sometimes we think very narrowly on when we're specifically asking a user to create a specific piece of user-generated content versus they are creating content. They are creating content right now, and all we need to do is actually capture it. And then there's some work for us to do in terms of actually curating it, finding the nuggets within that, which historically would have been very, very challenging. That would be hard to actually go through and listen to hours and hours and hours of video content, probably not a high volume of value coming out of that. But with these tools that can quickly convert these things into a transcript, and you can scan quickly through it. Again, you don't want to do this on every single meeting, but if you know there are meetings or events that are happening where this is the goal, is to be sharing knowledge, explaining initiatives. There are plenty of these things that are happening in an organization when things are rolling out. There's a lot of contextual stuff that's being captured. You can capture that in video format. You can chop it up, reproduce it very easily using some of these tools. And I think that's a different way to think about user-generated content using video. And I think this, again, is a way we can start to use video more in the work we do as we look at out into 2023 and beyond. So again, lots of opportunity, in my opinion, for us to do more when it comes to video. The next one I have on here is really the conversation around microlearning. To me, it's lost some of the steam that I think we saw several years ago. There was a real boom around microlearning, and now it's leveled off a bit, but I still see it continuing to rise with the number of tools out there that are actually focusing on supplementing. I would say supplementing. Do I think anybody should consider microlearning as their primary strategy and you shift everything over to microlearning? No. And actually, the folks I know who are doing microlearning and are focused on microlearning from a tech standpoint, and even practitioners, they would be the first to agree and attest to the fact that microlearning is not the panacea of learning and development. But to me, I still feel like this is an area we are underutilizing. So video and microlearning as the second one here is one I don't know that we're doing enough of this. And I think sometimes it's because we have this either or mentality around it. There's this idea that we're either going to have long form content or we're going to have short form microlearning content. And so we end up in this debate of that. And as a result, I think a lot of things do require long form content. So we completely eliminate microlearning content from that. If we think about it in terms of a supplement, and I know the folks over, I said I'd be careful about vendors, but I know certain ones are really talking about this specifically. 7Taps and Aris, I've had conversations with them recently. They're doing a lot with how are you using this content to augment and supplement your long form content. And I think that's a really important piece for us to consider along the way as we think about cohort style learning, as we think about some of this longer form content that we have. Maybe we still have some long form workshops that we're doing, but how are you actually then supplementing and extending the life of that experience and making it more sustainable using microlearning content around here? Now, again, I think this is a big area where video can be a huge supplement to this. If you think about it, if you're doing, going back to my example before, if you're doing a workshop or there's a live component of something that is part of your long form content and you're capturing that by recording it, and you then dump it into a tool that allows you to quickly go through and find some of the nuggets and components out of there, some of the biggest aha moments. Maybe at the end of a workshop, you ask everyone to share what is one of your biggest takeaways, things like that. What's something you're going to do differently, or what's something, a skill that you're going to develop? Whatever it is, I'm just throwing out some different examples. You can be capturing that and repurposing it. And this is where I think, as we think about things as professionals, the opportunity for recycling some of the things that we're already doing can help us move at a faster pace, help us reach people in many different channels. The idea that we always have to get everybody through anything versus everything versus what are there opportunities for us to say, hey, maybe there's this long form piece, maybe we're supporting it with some micro content that comes from the long form piece. We're repurposing components of it and creating a multi-dimensional learning experience. To me, this is one I think we can continue to explore. And I think this is where microlearning will continue to rise. And it should. It should be something that we are exploring, not as a replacement for the work that we're doing, not that we should be moving everything from one box to the other and chasing microlearning now as the thing. But I think what we should do is be saying, all right, where are there opportunities for us to repurpose some of our long form content or supplement it with other things? Again, just when I'm thinking multi-dimensionally about an experience, you may have a long form experience. There's no reason you couldn't be using a tool to create some micro nuggets along the way to incentivize or encourage people to do things that then get pushed and augmented. And you don't need to, this again is another shift when we think about microlearning. We don't necessarily need to mandate and assign all of this stuff as part of a learning pathway. We might be able to say, here's the main pathway. here's the side road. Here's some of the back roads that we have created as well to supplement, augment some of the work that we're doing. Now, the one thing I want to caution on this microlearning one, and I have seen this trend, it grew out of the microlearning boom and it's stuck around a little bit. It'll tie back to, if you didn't see my, I don't remember what I called it. I don't know, I did it in November where I was talking about things to be careful of. There's a time for us to really be reflective at what we've done. And one area that I see an opportunity with microlearning that's either going to perpetuate or we've already done it. And I think there's an opportunity. We can either get in front of it so we don't do this, or we might have already committed this and we need to go back and fix it. Sometimes there's this tendency around, especially some of these tools, to create lots of different user experiences for people. Well, this tool is cool, and this tool is cool, and this tool is cool. And pretty soon we've got this Franken experience, which we may think is really great because we used all these really fun tools and it's neat and all of this. But I do think it's really important we're careful that we are not creating a chaotic end user experience where someone's coming into something that we've produced and they're experiencing 15 different user experiences, having to relearn the interface, having to relearn how this is. So I think this is one caution as we look at microlearning and what we're doing. Now, this is more on the design side of it than the actual concept framework of microlearning. Microlearning is more the thinking about things in digestible bite-sized pieces, but then there's the actual authoring. How are you actually producing this? I think this is one area we do need to be careful with microlearning, that we aren't confusing our audiences by creating a chaotic experience with a multitude of different tools, and we're just throwing them at people without a whole lot of thought, which I think to some degree is why video can be a really good way to think about this, because overall video has a pretty consistent experience. So the ability to just short form it and make it into digestible chunks, you can then feed that into your existing infrastructure that makes it pretty consistent. All of this to say, one thing that I do think, I didn't actually have this on the list, so this is going to be one that ties to the microlearning and video piece that I've talked about, is cohorts. Cohort learning to me is still something we're going to need to keep an eye on. And I think there's a lot of value and merit to that in the way we design things. I'm not going to go into that in depth because to me, that's more of how we think about design. And I don't know necessarily that that's a trend. It is a trend that's continuing. But I do just want to encourage people, if you're still thinking in terms of, and this goes back to why I'm talking video, microlearning, multi-dimensional experience. To me, that goes very well with cohort design, where you say there's a extended experience that is multi-dimensional and is mixed up with some of these things. So if you still are in this camp of event-based learning, which sometimes get pegged only for live stuff, you may only be thinking of in terms of live stuff. It's not just live stuff. This same thing happens with when you think about e-learning content. If you're creating a single piece of content that gets assigned out to somebody and they go through it, that is an event-based learning. So I think that's where, when we start thinking about multi-dimensional experiences over time, development over time, this is where video, microlearning, some of these other concepts can really help make that a rich experience versus stacking just a bunch of events together. That is still event-based learning. And I think that's where we can go beyond that. All right. One thing I want to talk about as kind of the next one here, let me make a note of where we're at for the timestamps, is this ties actually to what I was saying before, and this whole idea of user experience and the consumption behavior we're seeing. I think it's really important that we think about what's going on in the consumer market and where people are at from a consumer standpoint, because this is affecting the water we swim in and the air we breathe when it comes to what people expect. So if we look at some of the consumer behaviors that are happening, how are we making sure that we're considering that in our work? And I think this ties to some of the conversations we've had around, and I think there's been some movement here in the tech space, being more thoughtful about, do these products interact and not interact. Gosh, now I'm thinking the term integrate. There it is. Do these products integrate with existing tech ecosystems? Are they integrating into the places where people are versus creating new destinations that people have to consider? I think the risk we run if we aren't considering, and this is a really important thing, this ties to really all of the things that I've talked about before, is where are people? So if you're creating microlearning, if you're creating video, if you're creating long form stuff, where are people and how are you reaching them where they are through the channels they're familiar with versus trying to create a new world that they have to add to their existing ecosystem. Again, this goes back to thoughtful consideration with this, because this isn't something that I would necessarily just say, there's never a time and a place for us to create a distinct user experience for something we're doing, something where we actually want to distinguish from what people are doing. I talked about this in, I don't remember when it was, but I talked about the fact that there are times we need to be intentional about taking people out of their usual flow, whether it's flow of work, flow of life, flow of whatever, and actually creating a distinct experience for them as part of that. I think there's tremendous value in that, but it should be done really thoughtfully. And I think it's really important as we watch going into 2023. I continue to see fatigue from the workforce. There is just an overall sense of fatigue and exhaustion from the amount of things being thrown at people, the new things they're having to digest and organize and figure out, how does this fit? Does it not? Does my body reject the organ or does it stay? And I think that's a really important consideration as we start thinking about this. Now, when we continue moving forward, this is only going to get more important, in my opinion, because of the fact there's a dark side to personalization. I think one of the dark sides to that is people come to expect experiences that are hyper personalized to them and where they are, which it's great that it's easier to do this, but it also creates a lot more complexity for us as we try and think about reaching people where they are. We no longer can just think, well, I'm just going to set up this one place, this one destination, and my expectation is that everyone is going to abandon what they're doing and come to me where I want them to be. So I think that's a really important consideration. This goes back to even what I was saying with microlearning. We need to be careful that we're not creating a whole suite of confusing microlearning tools that then actually is creating more chaos and confusion from a user experience standpoint. And if we are thinking about it, how are we not necessarily forcing it into our destinations, but integrating our destinations into the places where people are working? One of the big trends that came up, it's been a couple years now, I think, that may have a big impact on this. Not the impact I think everybody was expecting. I think there was a time, if you don't know what acronym I'm about to talk about, it is the EXP, or the Employee Experience Platform. I think there was a lot of conversations for a period of time that this was going to overtake everything. I have yet to see that really happen. At the same time, I think we are going to continue to see this potential consolidation of destinations that people go to. And I think it's an important one because it can feel really chaotic for people. But I think that some of the questions that we're having to consider are how that actually fits into things. And is the employee experience platform something that we need to actually set aside, lay our weapons down and say, you know what, we don't need to create another destination that we're going to ask and try and compete for people's attention when it comes for things. We're going to tap into some of these existing work systems where people are doing the work, and we're going to tap our resources and our content into those systems, knowing that the data is going to feed back and we're going to be able to control that experience from our end. But I think this is something that we need to keep an eye on, and it needs to be something we're thoughtfully considering as we look at what we want to do in 2023 and beyond. I think this is something that realistically, to me, this isn't a new trend. This is something that we really should have been, and many are, but we need to do more to thoughtfully consider, where are our end users? What are they doing? What tools are they in? And what tools are they familiar with? And let's do our best to try and create an experience that matches that and fits what they're doing, instead of going, well, here's what we want to do. And so we're going to try and stand up yet another thing that's now competing for their attention, competing for market share in terms of some of that user experience stuff. So that's more of something that I think lot of work to be done there. To me, one of the biggest opportunities in this user experience area still continues to be integrations. I know a lot of platforms now are talking, they have open APIs. On the surface, it looks like, yeah, we're very flexible. We can tap into any system. I would just caution people that if you're evaluating new technologies, if you're looking into that, be sure you take the time to understand and maybe talk to other people who may be using those tools to figure out how is that actually working in practice. I've just seen in my own career and many people in my peer circles where they thought, hey, this technology is going to really easily integrate into all these tools, all these workplace tools that are in existence, so we don't have to create another destination, only to find out that integration is not nearly as seamless. Now, I know I have a lot of tech vendors that are listening to this, and I would encourage you all to, in some regards, lay your weapons down. And instead of investing so much in trying to create the new destination for people, really try and make treaties and work together to try and work better as an ecosystem of tech. Because the reality is, I still stand firm behind the concept that the idea that we will ever get to a place where there is one platform that meets the needs of everybody, it just doesn't exist. And the reality is, even if we think it is, I've seen in many big organizations that go, well, this is the tool that everybody's using. When you actually dig into the subcultures and you actually see where people are doing work, it often is not the case. And so I think it's really important that we consider that and are very thoughtful about that as we go into the new year and as we continue forward, because it's only going to get worse in terms of the number of tools, the number of things people are doing, the more time people are spending on devices, things like that. And again, now we've got to add another layer of complexity to things in terms of consumption behavior, because while it's not, in my opinion, reached full maturity, immersive tech and wearables is coming. And so we have to think about some of those things. And I think about some of the things that we can do in terms of user experience, even things like, not even necessarily just eyewear, but watches, some of these other wearables that we have in existence that we can actually tap into and think about how can we actually leverage that? How can we actually encourage people to do things and provide them with support and resources along that way? So that's where I'll wrap on the user experience. But the one that I'm going to go to next is actually very closely tied to this, which is digital adoption tech. I know that this is one that I still feel is a big opportunity for our field. And I have plenty of conversations with learning leaders that would say systems is not really our space. We don't do much when it comes to systems. I just find that challenging when we think about the fact that so many of the activities our workers are doing, and this isn't just office workers, even our frontline workers, a lot of where their time is spent is in digital systems. And like I said, that's even happening in front lines. They're still behind a computer. Maybe they're not sitting there just doing work, but they may be working with a customer on something, or they may be using their phones and devices for things. They still are using some of this stuff to get their work done. And I think we need to be more active in thinking about so much work is being done in digital platforms and systems to turn our head and say, that's not really our space. Our space is not in systems. That's more of an IT thing. I think it's a huge, huge, huge miss for us as a function to walk away from that. To me, I feel like leaning into, especially, we talk so much about learning in the flow of work. We want to improve performance in the flow of work and change workflow learning. I don't know how we can say that and not acknowledge that systems play a big part in that. And the number of times I see organizations with these massive digital transformation efforts and all of this stuff, and then the way they approach, how are you actually approaching adoption for these technologies that are running the business processes, that are running the workflows, that are running all of the things where people are actually spending a vast majority of their time in a workday. And they're still leaning on traditional practices of, well, we send out job aids via emails. We set up a SharePoint portal where we put all the help resources. We do webinars. We put e-learnings in the LMS. I'm not saying those things need to go away completely, but I do think it's really important that we consider the fact that we can do better than that. Now, I will be the first to say, and this is one of the things I will caution people with the digital adoption technology. I'm a big advocate for it. In my opinion, just like the LMS is one of the bedrock platforms in an L&D organization, I feel like a digital adoption platform should be right alongside it. It really should. And I would go that far as to say, when it comes to bedrock technologies for learning and development, a learning management system and a digital adoption platform, to me, are two of the paramount ones when it comes to user consumption of content. We have our LMS to manage, track, to be able to store, and hopefully, going back to this integration piece, inject this stuff into other places where people are actually doing work while keeping all of the records and the analytics back where we are. And again, when I say LMS, I don't necessarily just mean traditional LMS. That could be something, there's a lot of content platforms that are doing some stuff like this. So I want to be careful with that. But just like the same thing with the digital adoption platform, we need to think about this in terms of, this is that digital layer that potentially sits on top of where all the work is happening. And again, these can work together in an ecosystem of, you may still have some of your learning management or content being just pushed through a digital adoption platform. This is another channel for us to be able to actually integrate and push some of these things out to people where the work is really happening while providing real-time guidance. And I think one of the things I will also add to this is, sometimes when I talk to people about digital adoption tech, the conversation gets a little convoluted, because when people think systems, they're thinking very specifically about the step-by-step, how does this actually get done? And sometimes that's where you get people that go, well, we don't instruct people on how to do these different system components. That may be true. Yet there's a lot of contextual information that goes along with these step-by-step instructions. There's a lot of contextual stuff that you want to talk about, reaching people with the relevant, going back to what I talked about earlier around microlearning content, maybe some of these other things that you may have in place in terms of, you may be creating content in other places, but it's now one of these things where you go, well, I need to make sure I'm pushing that to people at the right time, at the right moment. Well, what better way to know the right time and the right moment than to know when they're actually in that form field, or when they're actually on that page of the platform where this activity is going to happen. So I think sometimes we get limited in it because we think about the IT step-by-step, click here. This field is for this. This field is for that. It's yes, but it's also then the ability to say, okay, just as an example, if you think about this in terms of your HCM or maybe your performance management system, which would be inside your HCM, if you're thinking about, all right, we're trying to, let me just run, again, it's kind of a multi-dimensional way to think about this. Let's say you're doing one of the L&D initiatives around, maybe you're trying to improve, I'll just use an example that's close to home for me, performance management. You're changing your performance management process. There is obviously a system component to that. Maybe you've changed the interface of your HCM. Maybe you have a new HCM, or you've added new functionality. You need people to understand, here's the steps by which you would need to go through and actually put this information in place and actually do that. That's probably a component of that. I don't know that that's always the biggest challenge for people. Sometimes it is. I would say there's a healthy percentage that is actually that kind of stuff. The people actually need support. People get stuck all the time. Just talk to an IT help desk person. They will tell you, even in the systems that are so intuitive, they don't require training, they're getting lots of tickets from people who are confused and are stuck on how to use this platform. So I think it's a yes. And what better way to push some of these other multidimensional pieces of content to people than when we know they are doing it right then? We actually can know that they're doing it right then. So going back to this example of performance management, wouldn't you much rather push to someone a piece of micro content, encouraging them how to think about setting a development goal for someone on their team when they're actually setting a development goal, versus trying to guess the rough timeline in which, when is this kicking off? When is this happening? And, am I going to get it in the right window type of a thing? And I'll send a bunch of emails and overload people with information in hopes that they retain it versus, they're on that page, they're in that activity, their mind is there right now. What a great opportunity to actually say, hey, here's a relevant resource for you because I know you're doing this right now. And this is where I think digital adoption technology can go far beyond just the business process, making sure workflows are actually happening the right way, but actually providing some contextual, broader resources to people and to help support them with that. Now, the one pushback that I sometimes get on this that I will fully acknowledge and I think we need to account for is that enough? Can we just stop here? And this is where I always want to lay cautionary pieces with people that don't think me saying I think a digital adoption platform should be one of the bedrock platforms when it comes to an L&D function means that having a digital adoption platform is going to miraculously solve all of your behavior and change management and all these other components. It's not. There's still a need to, how do you even get people to know they need to go to the place and why they need to go there in the first place? They're not going to be in that location if they don't know they need to be there. So we still have to take all of the right communication, change management, just human behavior things into consideration. But when we actually think about the complexity of, okay, there is that element, there is that layer of what we're doing. Then there's also this, well, when they're doing it, what if they get stuck? Well, we now have the ability to support them in that and not ask them to break their workflow. If somebody gets stuck, we don't have to ask them to break their workflow. And furthermore, if we know that, hey, you're doing this, there's some stuff we really want to make sure you're considering before you go into this, we can actually push content into that workflow versus hoping that our efforts on the front end, which still are critically important, they're still critically important, but rather than banking on those efforts to carry it forward, we can think more holistically about the experience and say, hey, we did all these great efforts to make sure people have the context, they understand what's expected of them, we've told them what to do, but now when it comes down to the brass tacks of actually executing and doing it, we are providing them with the resources and the support and the guidance that they need to actually do that really well. Albeit, by the way, adding on top of it, the more we use these kinds of technologies, the more data we actually get to see. Are people actually engaging with this? Are they using it? Where are they getting stuck? The amount of data and value we can demonstrate from a quantifiable standpoint when it comes to digital adoption tech is really, really, really important. Now, again, don't take this section. I know I'm banging on this one pretty hard. Don't take this to mean that, does this mean I'm telling everyone that in 2023, if you don't have a digital adoption platform, the first thing you should do is run out and get one? Maybe that's what you should do, but I don't want to just conclusively say that because at the end of the day, it does all come down to priorities and we have to look at what are the most important priorities. But I think it's something that we should be thoughtfully considering in terms of if we have never considered this kind of tech, have never even come close to it, then we actually probably should very much consider it as we go into 2023 and decide, hey, based on some of these priorities, is this a fundamental bedrock capability that we don't have in our organization that we should have? Now, the caution to this one is there is more to it than meets the eye when it comes to setup and support and sustainability. So I do want to make sure I add that caveat to this, that there are certain platforms and technologies that I encourage people to have in their portfolio because I know they're low cost, low maintenance type technologies. They don't require a lot of upkeep and they don't require a lot of support to make them effective. This is one that does require a higher degree of resources, support, ongoing maintenance to keep it effective. Now, again, could you fail to do that and still have it be effective? Sure. Would it reduce its effectiveness as a bedrock technology? Not necessarily. I mean, think about our LMSs. How many LMSs have become digital dumpsters for people in terms of user experience, where they would be so much better if we had the ongoing discipline of cleaning out old stuff, making sure we're refreshing what's in there, keeping it relevant, making sure that we're filling out all the data tags and making sure we're doing all that. Yeah, LMSs to me and some of these platforms we use for managing our learning content I feel like we vastly underutilize them. But you don't necessarily go, because we don't use all that or we don't have that discipline, it's no longer valuable or relevant to the organization. It's still valuable and relevant to the organization. And I think the same is true for digital adoption tech. It's still relevant and can add so much potential to an organization, regardless of whether you have the rigor and full COE structure and resourcing to fully utilize that tech. So again, this one may be one I always continue to push a little bit harder on, but largely it's because I get so much pushback from our industry. Even some of the analysts I talk to challenge the idea of, is this really our space? Is this really something we should be involved in? And I would say, if our goal is performance, our goal is enabling our workforce to be the best they can be and grow in the flow of work, I just honestly don't know how you can say, I don't think this is relevant or something that we should be seriously considering as an evaluation for what we're doing in the work we do. So I will stop there. But again, more on that. I've talked to a handful of DAPs in Learning Tech Talk. So if you're unfamiliar with the capability, or you're like, what is he talking about? Digital adoption platforms, definitely look up some of those. I've talked about it at length. And again, I would just encourage people as we go into the year to be considering this kind of capability as that bedrock foundation amidst other ones. But again, I'm not telling you that should be your priority. Everybody run out and buy one, because I think knowing your situation and knowing what your priorities are is far more important than that. All right. The last one that I have on here that I will talk about for episode 1 is what I call LDaaS, which is learning and development as a service. This is something that, I mean, in our field, I think we have always historically, to some degree, supplemented our work with external resources, external vendors. It's not new to have external, whether it be consultants or companies, doing learning and development for us. A lot of times the focus is when it comes to, content development. I think that's probably one of the most familiar areas for folks is to have, and that's where this one may be less of something that we need to keep our eye on, is this idea of, oh yeah, hiring somebody to help us build e-learning content or digital content or strategy or things like that. I think that's something that we've been doing for a while. That's not necessarily new. I am seeing a shift, though, in the way that service is being provided, and I'm seeing it expanded out into other areas that historically have been more niche. It was live delivery, program management, even going back to digital adoption technology, professional services around that, implementation support. There's a lot of things that I'm seeing grow in terms of L&D as a service. And I think some of this is, as L&D has stepped into the limelight, into the spotlight in our organizations, as the need for skills and some of these other things, there is this greater recognition, hey, we need to support this function more. But from a scalability standpoint, organizations, and I think our industry in a whole, has a lot of ebbs and flows. We tend to have a lot of ebbs and flows. And when we have that, it can be hard to staff an L&D function to be fully internally resourced. And that's where sometimes when I have this conversation, people get a little bit nervous, because they're like, are you suggesting that we should outsource L&D? For some companies, there probably is a large degree of the work that L&D is doing that could, and maybe even should, be outsourced. And it should at least be considered for that, if we want to run our businesses optimally. Now, you may say, as a learning leader, how on earth can you recommend that we outsource a lot of our work? And it's one of those things where it's thinking objectively as a business person. This is the kind of decisions that we should be thinking about all the time. And I think the thing with it is, even when I've had conversations with business leaders in in a number of organizations where they've said, can't we just outsource L&D? My answer to that is no, nor should you want to. I don't think the answer to this is we should just outsource all of our L&D things. Do I think there's an opportunity for companies to augment and supplement their L&D shop with outsourced services and outsourced resources? Absolutely. I think this is something we should absolutely be considering, that will allow us to move at the speed of business and also have more of a business discussion with our business leaders around what are we actually trying to do here? Is this actually that important to you? If so, are we actually willing to make an investment in this? And not necessarily always vying for additional headcount. And this may be more of my personal take on L&D. I don't think that we should be seeking to build an empire in an organization. I think depending again on the organizational size and scale, there may be real need to have different specialties and capabilities and a relatively large. You may still require a large L&D internal organization. But to me, there still should be a healthy mix of externally resourced support to that. And I think that can be extremely helpful in the way we move. And I'm seeing more and more companies stand themselves up, focusing on this area in niche areas, which I think is something that we need to be paying attention to as learning leaders, is not necessarily always assuming we have to go to the usual portfolio of companies that we have in the past to do things. Because the reality is a lot of times they are not equipped or specialized to do that very well. And I think that's where we need to be careful. But there's a lot of these boutique companies that I see standing up that are focusing on very specific niche things. Just to give an example, leadership cohorts. To me, this is one of those things where you go, I mean, in some ways, from a scalability standpoint, depending on your hiring trajectory, it may make a lot of sense for you to outsource some of your leadership cohorts and actually improve the quality, because they can specialize in running those cohorts. And to me, there's tremendous value in encouraging leaders to interact with people outside the company. And so the ability to outsource some of that boutique, or would you call your usual e-learning or learning and development consulting firm to do that? Probably not, because I would guess they either, one, don't even have it in their portfolio, and two, even if they go, yeah, we can do that for you, they likely aren't specialized enough in it to do a really great job of doing it. Versus there's a handful of companies I know that are specializing just in leadership development cohorts, and that's what they specialize. And they've moved away from event-based stuff, where internally the time and energy it would take to completely overhaul your leadership development programs, you don't need to commit those kind of times and resources, and you can actually shift that out. Now, that may sound terrifying to learning and development professionals who maybe they're the ones delivering a lot of that content, going, wait a minute, are you suggesting that our companies consider outsourcing that? My answer would still be yes, but that shouldn't be seen as a threat to your job, because the reality is, this is where, to me, this is this multidimensional way we need to look at things. So to give an example of this, where you may think about, let's take leadership development as an example, where I think there's some real opportunity for learning leaders to consider some of this stuff. The fundamentals and foundational pieces of leadership development, okay? The basics of being a really good manager, being a really good leader, things like that. A lot of times that, to me, makes sense for a specialty firm to run and lead outside of your organization for a couple reasons. One, the way hiring cadences work, a lot of times in organizations I see, they are not offering leadership development, at least the let's make sure you're good at doing your job basics. It's not consistent. So someone may be in their job for quite a while before they even have the opportunity to be given access to the basic development they need to be an effective leader. So why would you not look at an outsourced opportunity that's going to be able to say, hey, we're running these all the time because it's all we do. So let us take that off of your plate so that when a leader starts, they get that development right away. It's not something they have to wait till next quarter or 6 months from now when the next cohort or the next program starts up. On day 2, day 1, they actually become part of this, and it becomes part of their development journey as a leader. You may say, well, I guess that kind of does make sense, because we can't, the amount of staff and resources and specialization we would need internally to run that, to support the enterprise, would be just incomprehensible. To say we have enough trainers and enough instructional designers to design this kind of experience, to run and manage this experience, to keep all of this stuff running. It doesn't make sense, in my opinion, when I've seen this over a number of different organizations, whether it's large or small. You may be like, well, what about giant companies where they have armies of learning and development? Yeah, but they also have 10 times the number of employees that this group is trying to keep up on. And a lot of times the reason they can't keep pace with business is because they're doing these things and trying to run the foundations versus saying, listen, let's outsource some of this stuff. Let's find a great boutique company that specializes in this area, that's going to lay the groundwork, can do it at the speed, scale, and quality that we can't to support our organization. Now, you may say, well, where does that leave us as learning professionals? Does that mean we just get rid of all our internal? No, absolutely not. Because the component that is still critical to this is there is a company specific layer that sits that needs to be intertwined with this. You may say, well, the basics of this, how to do the basics of being a manager, how to be an effective leader in an organization, that supersedes companies. That's not unique to any one organization. That can be outsourced and done with speed, scale, things like that. But then what you can do to supplement and augment this as you think about a multidimensional experience is say, our internal resources are going to design and lead and manage the components that are hyper specific to our company. How do we actually translate this to what does it actually look like to do those foundational things in our organization? What is the kind of accountability we have here? What are the systems we use to do that? What is the overall culture of these things? That absolutely, I don't think, and this is where I say, when people say, could you outsource L&D? No, I don't think you can, because that component is critically important. And that's a component that has to be led by people who are part of the organization. But a lot of times we can't go deep into this, and we can't commit to doing this on a really quick paced basis that keeps up with the speed of the organization, because we're so busy over here pushing the just day to day. We just need to make sure people get the foundations. Well, let's recognize that and say, hey, you know what? Let's take this off our plate. Let's find a place that's doing a really quality job doing this, that's actually going to offer more opportunity, can meet people where they are at a speed and scale that we can't. And then let's use our limited time and resources to then create that augmentive layer that supplements this other stuff and then says, okay, and then what else do we need to sprinkle on top of that? What else do we need to do where we can actually go deep and focus more on the community building within our organization, the relationships that need to happen, the overall growth and development, the personalization that needs to happen to make it really unique to our organization. So again, I think this whole learning and development as a service, I think some of the boom for this is coming from small and medium businesses now starting to catch on to the trend that, you know what, development is actually a critical business strategy. Developing our people, investing in our people, that's a critical business strategy. However, they don't have the luxury of saying, well, how do we hire in a full-blown L&D team that can actually do all this? So as a result, I've seen a lot of these boutique, smaller, specialized areas, not just in instructional design, but in delivery, in certain category areas, in certain things where you can say they're standing up to help support these small and medium-sized businesses. I think even large organizations should be taking a serious consideration at, should we be doing some of this stuff? But I think we need to do it carefully. Again, thoughtful, intentional effort going into this, not just saying, hey, yeah, let's just outsource all of our L&D stuff. No, I think that would be a very, very foolish move for anyone to do. Do I think there is some strategic opportunity for us as organizations to say, you know what, we might be able to actually do more for the business and meet them more where they are, put some shared accountability back on them, because now this is something that we're doing a different way. We might be able to actually share the cost. They have to invest in this kind of stuff. We actually may be able to do a lot more for the organization at the speed at which the organization is moving by not trying to grapple onto everything, keep everything kind of behind our four walls and say, no, anybody who doesn't do it like we do just can't do it the way we do it. And I think there's a real opportunity, and I'm seeing the market move to support this. So something else that I think every learning leader should be considering. Whew. All right. So I did make it through the 5 that I wanted to for part 1 of this. I'm glad I broke it into 2 parts proactively, because there is no way I could have gotten through the other 5 in the time that I have. So with that, I'm going to wrap on this one. I hope whenever it is that you're listening and watching this, that you have a wonderful rest of your week. You're having a great either rest of 2022 or kickoff to 2023. And I will have the part 2 of this coming up shortly after, probably the week after I officially launch this, or if you're listening to it, you may get it in 2 parts. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful one, and we will see you on the other side.